Go back to the university and do your PhD and pay attention to the research, which makes sense to do. Just don't copy paste what previous generation did. Think before you start doing anything, like Kristi did. We need it.
So PSA, yeah, do go and get your PhD.
I think that was a really good argument for getting a PhD, right?
It was. But if you still feel like insecure about it and think like, gosh, this is so much work. It's great, but like, is it really me? Then go back to our previous episodes and listen to the episode with a professor from University of Oregon, Hurston.
Yeah.
Which is a no PhD ever professor career episode.
Yeah, we have like both spectrums of that. That's interesting.
Yeah, two really smart people that are both in academia and have, like fairly strong opinions one way or the other, which is, it is interesting. But I think that Kristi, she has taken this angle of all of these different little pieces that add into design. So it's not just getting an undergrad and then a master's and then a PhD that are all in industrial design, right? Which is probably why it's worth continuing to add on more and more layers of education.
Yeah, there's a lot of diversification of academic credentials there. Kind of like Anna. Actually, like a lot of our guests, I feel like there's a lot of backgrounds being put together.
I feel like that's the thing we're learning is how much a good designer seems to sometimes come together by walking an unusual path and like picking up a lot of different odds and ends along the way. Not sure how to go diversify my path right now. Let's see. Gotta get some new spice in there.
I think you're doing it. You're like actively
quit my job. True.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good point. I'm excited to hear some reactions about all of those spatial tests when people try to take them. They were kind of fun.
Yes.
And that is crazy information about the bias in establishing, like, not just in design, but that spatial label of like men versus women being good at it in psychology based on those. That's shocking. Kristi's so special. I know I feel this way at the end of every episode, but I think she really is getting to the bottom of questions that are right there for people to think about, and nobody is paying attention to them, and I'm just very grateful that she was like, oh, it's me. I need to answer those questions that are sitting right here in front of us.
Yeah, I'm hoping she can inspire the same spark in all her students.
Seriously. That's going to be a really badass class of designers.
Looking at you, University of Kentucky School of Design.
Welcome to Beyond Ray, women-led conversations on industrial design. I'm Kate, joined today by Ginger and Margaret as usual, and our guest on the show is Kristi Bartlett. Kristi's a PhD candidate in technology at Purdue. Her and I originally connected because she's researched gender dynamics in podcasts about design, and so she'd come across Beyond Ray and connected with us on Discord before we then all got the chance to really know her well at the Women in Design conference in Chicago, which was a really cool opportunity. Kristi is also the director of product development at Zibrio, where she designs fall risk assessment and fall prevention products. And lastly, and very excitingly, she's an incoming professor of product design at University of Kentucky. Kristi, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the research that you do, because we're definitely going to get into that, and your process to, pursuing the PhD and the work that you do.
Sure. To start, I think I should tell you a little bit about why I got into design, because that kind of led me to where I am now. So I originally studied engineering in my undergrad. I studied civil and environmental engineering, and I ended up not pursuing a career in engineering because, being based in Houston, most of my friends and classmates were going into oil and gas for their careers, and that really didn't resonate with me. So I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. I worked for a nonprofit for a while, and then a few years after I graduated, my daughter was born, and she had a lot of really serious medical issues. So suddenly I found myself using medical devices to take care of her at home. It was like a crash course in becoming a nurse and having to use all these different tools to take care of her at home. And suddenly I became so frustrated because I saw that the medical products, they didn't have the same care put into the design as most consumer products that I was used to using. This was in like about 2014. And a lot of people, were obsessed with the iPhone and like these super cool technology. But then I was using like much more primitive feeling devices to care for her and really to keep her alive. And I thought, why is it that these devices that are meant to keep somebody alive are designed without really a lot of care to the usability or to the appearance when people don't even have a choice of whether or not they use these things? Wow. So that's really what led me to decide to go pivot in my career and go back to school to get a master's in industrial design and study industrial design in the first place.
Wow. So you already knew that was design. You were clocking. How did you become aware that was really the issue you were encountering in the products?
That's a good question. I was somewhat familiar with what design is, but my university where I did my undergrad did not have any sort of design degrees. So I had learned about, I think I did a summer internship that was like engineering design. So engineering has design, right? But it's a bit different in the approach, and it's much more related to the functionality and just getting things to work, and a little bit less focused on the usability and definitely less focused on the aesthetics. So during that internship, I had learned, I think there was a company that like presented, we went to some seminar, a company presented about their process. It was a medical device company. There's a lot of medical stuff in Houston, which is where I was. And that company, in their presentation, they showed like, hey, we use this design consultancy to help us with our product. And then I Googled that design consultancy. I have no idea what one it was.
That's not the point to ask.
I have no clue. I might be able to figure it out by Googling, but I looked on their website and I was like, wait, somebody does this work? Like, wow, that's so interesting. So I learned at that point what industrial design was, but I wasn't in a point where I was going to like transfer universities and start all over with a different degree. So I thought it was cool, but whatever. I finished my degree and kind of forgot about it. And so later, when I was considering pivoting into design, or basically I was considering pivoting into working on medical devices. And I thought, okay, I could go to get a bioengineering master's, but I realized I wouldn't be learning the stuff that I wanted to learn. And I wanted to learn more about the users and more about how to make products like more comfortable and more appealing. And I think I found that there was a master's program at University of Houston, which is the city I was already living in industrial design. So I said, okay, I'll try that. I don't want to move. I wasn't in a position to be able to move. So that's the only master's program I applied to. And I got in and I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
So to sum up, at some point in your life, you had to use more medical products, and then you memorized that once someone showed you that there is another way of making those, and you had the flashback that there is something in it and maybe you would like to be part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really while I was there in my master's degree that I realized what research is, and that I might like to do research and I might like to teach, because I had some chances to be like a teaching assistant, a TA during my master's. So that experience, getting the master's, planted the seed for me to want to do a PhD later down the road. But for a few years, like actually during my master's, I started working in the job that you mentioned before at Zibrio, which is a medical device company. And that was based in Houston. So I just wanted to get into it right away and start working on that. So I've been working there now for 6 years while I finished the master's. And then I was working there full time for maybe a year or two and then started the PhD.
Oh, cool. So did you come in on the engineering side and you've sort of shifted through design and research? You've done a lot of different roles with them?
Yes, absolutely. Since
cool.
It's a startup, I joined, I think I was just looking for an internship while I was doing my industrial design master's. I said, okay, I know in order to get into a different career, like I just need to get started. So I was originally the engineering design intern, and I was working on like the 3D printed prototypes for our clinical testing. I worked on like soldering the boards for our clinical prototypes, just anything that they needed me to do. And then since they saw I had design skills, they said, oh, like maybe you can help design our app. Oh, what do you think our final product should look like? Like work on the industrial design for that. And it just kind of grew and grew. Since it's a small team, everybody has to be all hands on deck. Whatever you know how to do, you do it. And so that was a great opportunity for me to put all my skills into practice right away.
So you said that you pursued a PhD due to your interest in research and, that you enjoyed teaching. Did the PhD feel like a one-stop shop for that? Or is there like a reason that you didn't want to pursue research in like the private sector? Like would it have been too difficult to do the research you wanted in the private sector?
Well, the way that I view a PhD is really like it teaches you how to do research. So it basically, it's kind of like a degree, like you study something, but also you're taking all these courses where they train you. This is how to do like a quantitative experiment. This is how to do a qualitative experiment. This is how to write a research paper and get it published so you can like disseminate your findings. So even if I wanted to be a researcher in the private sector, most likely to get a good job in there, you would need some sort of PhD to get you hired, basically.
Gotcha.
And so typically industrial design, like most of the professors don't have PhDs because they're much more practice-based and just kind of like, oh yeah, I did my professional practice and now I'm going to tell the students what I know. And it's much more teaching focused. But I wanted to also be able to do more traditional research than what's usually done in design.
Do you think there's a like dearth of this research practice in design?
I personally do, yes. And I think that if we had more people who were trained both in design and like could speak the language of design, but also really knew how to do academic traditional research, maybe we would be a little bit further in terms of understanding things like, oh, why are there not very many women in design? You know, like we don't have a lot of people who know how to design a robust study to help answer that question, right? So then we just kind of talk in circles and say the same thing for decades, what it seems to me.
This might be a good time to start talking about some of the research that is published so far.
Yeah.
I had like a million questions about these things. Like you have several papers about spatial visualization and perception and like how it's been used to gender the design field and engineering also. Like I started to read sort of the summaries and they're these very like technical, very academic papers. So you had a really like robust study designed around this. Like how do you even begin to think about this and go about writing a paper?
Sure. Let me tell you a little bit more about like how I got interested in that area, because hopefully it'll help set the scene. So I remembered a couple years back, I was attending a different women in design conference. I think it was like I was attending virtually, so I was just listening afterward. But I remembered one of the girls had said, I think she was a young professional industrial designer, and she was talking about her experience in college. And she said that her first teacher had told everybody, oh, you know, the girls aren't usually as good in CAD. So if you're a girl, just ask the boys to help you with CAD. And I see everyone's like, every time I tell that story, people are like, oh my gosh. But like that really happened just a couple of years ago. And I know that there's that stereotype is out there that like women aren't good at CAD. So I started to wonder, I remembered that when I took a psychology class in my undergrad, that we had learned that supposedly women have worse like spatial skills than men. So what that meant, this fact that's out there, like literally written in psychology textbooks, was suggesting that men are better at like visualizing and manipulating 3D space in their minds, and that women didn't have this skill. And so people are using that idea to say, oh, this is why there aren't as many women in engineering or in industrial design or in CAD, like these disciplines that require you to manipulate 3D space. So that kind of got me interested in the topic, just knowing that like people are out there saying this. Is it really true? Like I want to know for myself.
Let me stop you. I heard before the story that men are supposed to have like better 3D visualization skills, and that's what makes them better in CAD. But I also wonder, how much is it about like management of the whole product? Is there a possibility, maybe you can answer it as a researcher, or maybe that's your next task, that maybe women in school would put more time into research, into focusing on user, into making a case, and then there will be just like less time for CAD and they would do what's needed. And men would be like, oh, this looks cool, let me do CAD for 3 weeks. It makes me thinking because I just sent to a factory a CAD which I know is very faulty, but there was a schedule and I know there is so many other builds, and I was just thinking, we need to have it done. I have to have more people have eyes on it. No, I will not perfect it. I know it will change 5 times. At some point in the process, I would get like a professional surface modeler to polish it up. Now I'm just problem solving to hit our goals. Is it something that women are more likely to do than men?
I mean, I haven't done any research studies on this, but I do believe that it's true that there are more men out there pouring more time into working on CAD models, whether that's students who just like love that part of the project, or maybe they don't feel as confident in the research part or the presentation part or some other parts, and they feel more interested in the CAD and spend more time in that. I think that's definitely a good possibility.
But there is more to it.
Yeah.
Where did this story that you're saying was in psychology textbooks come from anyway. Like, that's not to do with design, right? That's a whole bigger story that we've been perpetrating. Like, what?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it came really from psychology researchers and the way that they were doing their research to basically shape this narrative. If it's okay, I'm gonna share the screen so I can show you some of the like test questions. And I know it's a podcast, but maybe we can describe what we're seeing.
Yeah, like we can read some out. Sure. And we can also share it in the description.
Okay, I'm sharing this. Can you see that little picture?
Yeah, these blocks
Yes.
in
Okay.
weird layouts with the number A, B, C, D positions.
Yeah, so this is like a multiple choice question from a test that was supposed to measure your spatial skills. So I'll explain it. So on the far left, there's like one shape that's drawn and it's like 10 boxes stuck together. That kind of looks like a boxy snake, essentially. And then there's 4 other versions, like similar figures on the right. And what you're supposed to do is look at the figure on the far left and then using mental rotation or like rotating the figure around in your mind, you're supposed to pick which of the 2 options on the right are that same shape, but like rotated into a new position.
Right.
A and D.
Yeah, I think C. It's not that easy. Okay.
I think
I thought it was
D
D,
for
and
sure.
then I wasn't sure about A, so I'm looking at it closer.
D is right. That's one of them. There's one
Cool.
more.
So it is it?
Okay, so
There's 2. There's 2 that are correct. So you have one, which is D, and then the other one is A, B, or
I
C.
think it's A.
I still think it's A.
But that is tricky.
I think it's A.
Oh, I think
Yeah.
you're right.
I
Yeah,
think
you're
that is
right. It is A.
A
I
and
was
D.
It's
thinking
just
that I was
this
showing
way.
a different example. That was, yeah. Sorry.
Nice.
I'm like too used to presenting this. And usually I present one that's B and D. But yes, okay. But I think you can see that it's very confusing. And part of the reason it's confusing is like the pictures aren't very good. So you can barely see what they are. Like, it's just hard to tell which way the different arms of the snake or whatever the body of the snake is pointing. And
Right.
that's part of the reason that it's hard. Or there's parts that are hidden from behind. Like
The lines
you
are
can't
sort of
see
like
it.
blurred and not printed very well. Yeah.
Yeah.
It messes with the perspective a bit. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So that's one of the tests. This is one question from the test. There's like 20 questions on the test, and you're supposed to do it really quickly. And then it's supposed to tell you, how good your spatial visualization skills are, or your mental rotation skills. That's one test that's used a lot. Then the other one looks like this. So this one, there's like 2 blocks in the top row, and you're supposed to figure out what rotation happened to move it from the first position to the second position. Then you look at that shape in the middle and you try to perform that same rotation on that shape and pick one of the multiple choice answers.
Okay, give us a sec.
I think my test anxiety is coming into play more than my 2D brain. Okay.
I think it's B.
I think it's
so
B.
too.
Yeah, you're right. So in this test, some of the other questions though, the shapes get really like weird looking.
Are we in
Oh.
the impossible geometry right now?
You also
Yeah.
can't tell in the top one, you can't tell if it's rotated. If that part on the bottom, oh, maybe you can.
Yeah,
Okay,
you
take it
can't since
back.
it's not symmetrical. But
Okay.
a lot of people, like maybe for you, since you all are designers and you're like familiar with isometric views, maybe
Right.
that like all of these answer choices, A, B, C, D, and E, are all actually different isometric views of that shape in the middle.
Right.
But for a lot of people, they won't be able to see, like they can't see how B is actually a view of that middle shape.
Yeah, I cannot see that. How come it's a view?
Yeah,
Yeah, because there's no perspective at play.
exactly.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah,
perspective.
you're getting kind of an Escher
So
thing
you-
going on.
Yes.
So this is already assuming basically that you have like some engineering exposure, which is not the same, right, as just having good spatial awareness. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. But the insight that you've just given is not an insight that people who are using this test are taking into account.
People that are doing this test, you're saying that they're not able to recognize that it's biased in the fact that it already assumes some previous exposure or information?
Yes. So people have not taken that into account, and they're just saying this test measures your, spatial skills. And so that actually in some universities in engineering programs, they'll give this test to all the freshmen, and then whoever scores low, they'll put them in a class to like teach them spatial skills, supposedly. And this test, since women tend to score lower on it, a bunch of women are getting thrown into this essentially remedial class, which is then telling them like, oh, you're not really cut out to be an engineer, so you need to go in this remedial class. When, like you've just pointed out, somebody could be perfectly capable of visualizing things in 3D, but this test presents it in isometric views and really assumes that you have some background in engineering, which is not, it's not testing your like actual mental capabilities. That's just, you might as well have just asked people, do you already know engineering from whatever you learned in high school or the clubs you were in before this?
Or your parents, or
Exactly. Yeah. They've made it into this much bigger thing. So that's one part. One part of the problem is just using these bias tests. But actually what I found when I was reading a bunch of old material about spatial skills is that the reason that they're using these bias tests is because they felt so strongly that men had better spatial skills than women that they decided that the only tests that are good to measure spatial skills are tests that will produce this difference. So they use these tests because men perform better than women. And then they said, these tests measure spatial skills the best because men perform better.
That's horrible science.
Exactly.
Actual?
Oh my God. So did they rule out tests that had a lower split gender-wise?
Yes.
What?
Yes, there have been like hundreds of different tests made over time that are supposed to measure spatial skills. And these that I've just shown you are two of the most popular. But there's plenty that either didn't have gender differences or there's some where like women tend to do better than men. And they don't really use those ones. They're not as popular.
What are the ones where women do better? Do you know them as well?
There's one called like the differential aptitude test of spatial relations. And it's a little different. Like it doesn't have these isometric views like I'm showing you. It's more like a box. It's like an unfolded flat pattern of a box with some shaded sides. And then it will show like the folded up box and with some shaded sides and you figure out which box it is. So it doesn't have the same sort of like engineering bias, in my opinion, because most people know what a box looks like. And it's not the same as looking like these weird triangular shapes that I'm showing you now. But that's one of them that women often perform just as well, if not better, than men.
Which sounds more aligned to like sheet folding, which could be metal, but also pattern making and sewing.
Fabric? Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I did an experiment where I contacted a woman who did her master's in like apparel design, and she had updated this so-called spatial test for apparel design. And I said, oh, let me use like your test with these engineering students. So I gave the engineering students that apparel design test, and the girls did better than the guys. Like big surprise, because it was showing basically clothing patterns that you needed to fold up or, form into a 3D shape, which is a clothing. Obviously, creating a clothing pattern requires just as much spatial thinking as creating a CAD model.
It's really complex.
Yeah. And women have been like thriving and excelling in apparel design for centuries. And nobody says like, oh, maybe there's not as many men in apparel design because they don't have the spatial thinking to do it.
Yeah, right.
But that's essentially what could have happened if there was an alternate reality where people were acting like spatial skills were important in apparel design, but they don't really talk about that as much because spatial skills, this concept of spatial skills as they've come up with it, is so associated with STEM and engineering and, male-dominated disciplines that they really ignore the role that this 3D thinking would play in more female-dominated disciplines.
It also feels like it really supports this theory that previous exposure is a big driver, because maybe more women have been exposed to a sewing pattern at some point in their life. Yes. And so they also, not only do they have the 3D skills, but they have the understanding of, oh, this is a little part of a pattern I'm supposed to line up, and this is a dart or whatever, right? The reference points.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Can you just tell us more about your overall approach to setting up a study? Because we've gotten very granular in this, but I think I want to know, how somebody might approach thinking in this way if they are trying to understand if they have bias or trying to understand, how something is skewed.
Sure. I think the driving thing of a study is usually going to be your research questions, which are like the questions that you're trying to answer with your study. And then from the research questions, people will sometimes you'll have a hypothesis. If it's an experimental study, like some of the work I've done with these spatial tests will be an experimental study. So like in the study where I was using that apparel test, I had a hypothesis that a test from a traditionally female-dominated discipline would show different gender patterns than a test from a traditionally male-dominated discipline. And then beyond that, you have to design the methods for your study. So how you're going to actually collect data and then how you're going to analyze the data. And then you execute the study and then you write your paper. And as Ginger pointed out, typically in academia, you write the papers in this very like the certain academic voice, right? That can be really kind of inaccessible to people outside of academia, but that's kind of the expected way to communicate about your science in academic journals. And then hopefully you have opportunities to talk about it more casually like we're doing now.
I do think there's probably a purpose to some of the academic writing for sort of the accuracy, clarity of communicating your study. And to the end of that, like, accuracy and clarity, how do you check for, like, when and if there's any bad science happening and how do you correct? Because, like, the people who designed this study who liked it obviously were engaging in bad science. This was some confirmation bias that they used to justify their study. I assume that there's a lot you do to make sure that the study is sound. And part of it is because you want it to be defensible, so that you're not just countering bad science with bad science.
Right. I think I read this essay. I'll have to look for the woman's name that wrote it, but she wrote it in the 80s. And her essay was basically asking whether feminism and science could be compatible. Because the way that science works is you always have to like build in layers on top of what other people have done. So a lot of times, like the reason that people are using these tests is because, oh, these other researchers used it. So this is the precedent that was set. And we just need to like do a similar experiment, but slightly different so that we can push knowledge a little bit further forward. So when people build on these layers and the foundation is actually like extremely sexist or extremely racist, what have you, then that becomes a problem for future researchers who don't really dig down deep to the very bottom and ask the question of like, where did this actually come from? Like, who made this test? Why did they make it this way? How was it validated? Like a lot of times people don't ask those questions because they're kind of operating at this top layer of like, oh, well, I know this, this researcher at XYZ University does it this way, so I'm going to do it that way too, because it's already been established by somebody else.
So this is like critical theory in academia, the same way there's critical theory in law. That's super interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, where did you even go to dig deep enough to realize that these people that established these tests as the standard were filtering for gender disparity, like success?
Well, some of it I just came across as I kept digging. So honestly, I had submitted one paper to a journal. And when you submit a paper, you have to get this feedback from the reviewers. And one of the reviewers told me like, oh, you need to write more about this thing, so look up this book. So then I got that book from the Purdue Library, and it was this book that then in the back it was like the Handbook of Spatial Tests or something was the book. So it sounds like pretty dry, but then in the back there was a section about gender, and that section was just like horrifying. But basically in that section it laid out all these things that I've been telling you. Like they were saying, here's the criteria for how to decide if a spatial test is a good test. And 4 out of the 10 criteria are about quote unquote sex differences and make sure the test shows sex differences. So it was really just a coincidence, right? That this person recommended this book to me, having no idea that there was a section in the back that was, the smoking gun of the problems with this whole field of research. But then, from that book, I thought, okay, well, let me see what else this author has written. And then could find more of his research and see like, okay, now I see where he got these ideas because he wrote about it in this book. And then I could read the papers that the book was mentioning. So it's kind of just like following the trail, essentially, to find out more about what was going on. Because like I said, in science, you have to kind of add citations to other people's work. And so then as I read through and kind of trace back the citations, I could find out what assumptions they were basing their research on, essentially.
Some research forensics there.
Yeah. It was
Congratulations.
fun.
I just am like, you did it, Kristi. You found it.
That's so wild that this author would tell on himself like that, but he probably didn't think there was anything wrong with saying that.
Because it's not, Absolutely. He doesn't think it's bad. He thinks it's like important. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the weird thing about it, right? Is just coming from such a different mindset.
Wow. Well, so one of the ways, obviously, that this research plays out in a very relatable way to our audience, I think you also mentioned as like these feminized sub-disciplines in your work. I wonder if you could tell us more about how you've started to see sub-disciplines of design or design-adjacent work get split up by gender, and where you think some of that corralling is coming from.
Maybe start explaining what do you mean by feminized subdiscipline, so people can have good picture of what are we going to talk about right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess that I'll start with, I looked up so I could explain, but I looked up the definition of masculinization rather than feminization. So I'll read you that definition. It says, to masculinize something means to make it into something that involves mainly men or is thought suitable for or typical of men. Then the opposite in this, contrived thing, because obviously these aren't natural things, to feminize something would be to make it into something that involves mainly women or is thought suitable or typical of women.
Which means pink it, shrink it.
Sure, pink it, shrink it. Yeah, that's perfect. And then within design, I think people can think of like certain subfields of design that are currently seen as more suitable or typical for women. Like, let's say, toy design, CMF, which means color, material, finish design, if you're not familiar with that. I think in industrial design, a lot of people see more women going into UX and kind of look down on UX, probably for that reason. Even graphic design, I think for industrial designers, that's seen as a little bit more suitable for women. Are there others that I'm missing? Fashion.
Apparel, probably apparel things.
Oh, yeah.
Unless they get very technical and then it gets pushed back to men. Yeah.
And I would say also design research.
Yeah.
And the pet products. Everything for children.
Yeah, everything for children.
From strollers to car seats.
Housewares.
Yeah, and housewares. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when I think about like, why does this happen? I think it's partly, again, kind of connected to engineering. So I'll tell you about this really good essay that I read about engineering by this woman who studies engineering, Wendy Faulkner. So she wrote this essay called Dualisms, Hierarchies, and Gender in Engineering. And she argues that engineering has these dualisms, or these kind of like two-part polarized phenomenon. And one of them is the technical social dualism. So people see technical work as very separate and kind of at odds with social or like people-related work. So within engineering, like within an engineering company, people are going to put less value on the people-related work and more value on the technical work. And they also see the technical work as more suitable for men and the people-related work as more suitable for women. But then we see this play out in design also. And you can think about some of the subfields we just mentioned. Like technical things would be like CAD and shop skills. And those are kind of seen as more suitable for men. And then user research is seen as more suitable for women because it's more related to people. So I think that part of the reason that industrial design does this is because we are very closely connected with engineering, right? And so a lot of industrial designers work side by side with engineers in companies. And I've heard from countless people that industrial designers often feel like they're being looked down on by the engineers, or like they have to really like work so hard to get taken seriously or to get their ideas heard or to be valued. So if we see engineers as like kind of exerting this dominance over industrial designers, essentially, and industrial designers feeling inferior, like that's going to be a dynamic that affects our industrial design culture within itself. So another dualism that this author wrote about, Wendy Faulkner, was the abstract versus the concrete. So in engineering, like things that are very concrete are valued and things that are more abstract are not valued. And if you think about design, like the industrial designer in the room is like, hey, well, what if we did this? And like, it's their job to throw out more abstract ideas. It's their job to work on the aesthetics and the things that are going to be seen as either like abstract or, irrational in the face of engineering. So I think that these kind of dynamics where engineering devalues these things that are kind of inherent to what design is, leads design in general, industrial design, to try to make itself more masculine in order to get taken seriously by engineering. So then they'll say, oh no, we don't work on the colors. That's that lady over there.
Mm-hmm.
She's the CMF designer. We are doing this really serious CAD. It's very technical, Oh, we don't do art. We do sketching.
So trying to step on someone else in order to get yourself leveled up.
Yes.
It's a horrible system.
Yeah.
I feel like I've also heard it play out in a very like process driven way. Like how some design is going to be more like wishy-washy or not as good at deadlines or things like that. And that somehow also gets like shuffled into the way that design is approached and how like mathematical it is versus how much the users are involved or how much is like community oriented about it, which is an interesting division as well, because it doesn't, you can definitely be very, very organized and on time and good at deadlines and still be incorporating a lot of people's feedback and driven by like group thinking, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But then we do have this thing, right, where sometimes women maybe gravitate towards these feminized subdisciplines, and it's a little chicken and the egg about like pressure or socialization or, you know, maybe even not even a bad way socialization, like good at some of the skills that are in those soft disciplines because of a bunch of other stuff that is tasked to us our whole lives.
Yeah. I think there's like two things going on here, right? Because on the one hand, it's not good if women are being like forced into areas that they're not interested in. That's not good. But if they are genuinely interested in those areas, that's great. And then the problem is that we don't value those areas.
Or it's an educational problem because the teachers, professors would be pushing women to grow their interests in this typical female subdisciplines while they would push guys to develop their skills elsewhere. Like I said, it's hard to find the professor, like, you know, see a situation when the professor looks at the sketches and be like, hey, I think you would be an amazing car designer. Why don't you go join my class? I know it's like mostly guys, but I see you're very talented. Maybe you want to bring a friend with you. So we will have two of you develop these skills. It's not happening. If you want to go there, you would have to go there yourself, even though you're not sure yourself if you're so much interested in it, because it just wasn't part of what you were thinking of before. For so many people, like design itself, like industrial design itself is a new field they didn't know about. They discovered it by accident. Thinking of our guests, everyone discovered industrial design in college or later by pure accident. And imagine in this situation where you are just thinking, oh, is it something I should be pursuing? Start thinking about, should I try to pursue the more male dominant part of it? Maybe I would be good in it, but unless someone tells you, hey, I think you should really try it, you wouldn't try to join some, you know, class you already feel unwelcome while you're so new to it and you want to learn for yourself what is that you will be best at.
So I was curious what you think about the effect of gender division in academia is, and like as a professor, like, do you have goals for the impact you hope to have on your department?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've thought about that a lot. And honestly, that's part of the reason, part of my motivation to become a professor is because both in my undergrad and my master's, where I studied engineering and then industrial design, I had barely any female professors. And I absolutely think that makes a difference. I know when I was an undergrad, I was too scared to go to the professor's office to ask a question, you know, so how is that going to help me be successful? And I think it does matter to see that representation, but also to have the mentorship or to have people, like you're saying, Margaret, to have people who are going to say, hey, you're good at this, try this, like do this, and really encourage you and push you forward. I have noticed that there are quite a few industrial design programs that have no women teaching in them, or almost no women, or maybe like a lecturer. And I think it's really sad. I think in some cases it's not a priority for them. In other cases, they're hiring usually their own graduates. And then their own graduates tend to be more men because they were in a program with all male professors. And the girls who tried to do the program were told like, hey, you seem good in graphic design. Like, do you want to, you know, like it's just this self-perpetuating cycle. So I hope that it will change. The program that I'm joining at University of Kentucky, it's going to be majority women teaching there. Actually, I think it's 3 and 2. Wow. So that will be a very unique experience.
How do places that are not University of Kentucky change? How do they go towards that?
I mean, I think they would have to be intentional to try to hire women. And I have noticed that that's not usually the way that any university hiring operates. I think they don't. It just doesn't usually work that way from my observation and from reading a book about faculty hiring. Typically, diversifying the faculty is not like a very highly rated goal for most universities.
But that's interesting because...
What a huge miss.
A lot of universities seem to have diversity goals for the student body, which is, of course, contentious right now because of the recent Supreme Court ruling. Can they really achieve diversification of the student body without doing so with the faculty?
They can bring the students in, but the students might not have a good time, right? They might not have a good experience with all their professors are, homogeneous group that doesn't share their background.
What is going on at University of Kentucky? It sounds like they're being very intentional about this.
I don't know. I don't have an insight into their hiring process, but it's a brand new program. So there's going to be 5 professors when I'm there. So that it's just, wow. I think that's part of it, right? It's a new program. So they're not hiring their own graduates because they don't have any. It's, they're having a fresh start I think they started in 2020. Having a fresh start in 2020 is going to look really different than this kind of entrenched thing from a long time ago.
Wow.
You must be really looking forward to.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited for sure.
So you told us, that you're going to encourage students, maybe kind of try to notice the skills that they have and champion them, which is great. Are there other ways that you've already thought about setting up your research parameters in a given class, or project types that you might approach, or class structures? Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's not even just that I want to promote. I would really like it if everybody comes out really confident in all the different skills, right? Or at least they had the chance to really give it a good go in every skill. And so I think one area in design that can particularly be problematic is like when there's a group project. Sometimes if the group is assigned, people will just like go forward with the skill that they're already confident in. And that can end up with the girl working on the presentation while the guy makes the model and welds it, something like that. Like, I do not want my classes to be just kind of not diversifying people's skills. Like, I would hope that everybody can really grow in all the different skills and then make an informed decision about what they like at the end when they got a fair chance to do everything. And I think the project type is absolutely an important thing to look at. I know that in some of other people's research that I've read about industrial design, when they interviewed girls who dropped out or chose to leave industrial design, a lot of them said, the projects didn't resonate with me. We were doing power tools and I don't like power tools. So I think having just more opportunity for the students to really work on things that relate to their own personal interests, and having a little bit more open-ended projects could be helpful for that, or just choosing things that are a little bit more gender neutral than power tools that don't have this like gendered history, essentially, could be helpful too.
How do you think that will prepare the students for when they go out into the workplace working on products that they don't love because they go work at a company that's available that had a job opening? How does that get reconciled?
I mean, I think that's a good question, but like that's going to happen either way, I guess. So I think while you're learning, that's a little bit different. I think learning, it's okay for learning to be fun and like more of a time for you to explore and do what you want to do and figure out what you like. And hopefully if you figure out that you like design, then you can apply something about that to a project that you don't love when you're out working. And maybe, after a while you might hate the project in school that you chose. That could still happen. But I think learning, I don't know, I really want to help my students gain like a passion and interest for design. And that might never happen if they're always assigned something that like really doesn't resonate with them.
That's true.
We didn't really cover, why did you look into the podcast when researching your female representation in the ID-related media?
That's a great question. Well, I started the project actually for a class. I was taking a qualitative research class. And so I needed to do some research where I used like qualitative data or like non-numerical data. Now, I don't remember why, but I know I had listened to industrial design podcasts. I had noticed some things that were a little off. And so I thought, why don't I do an analysis of these podcasts for this class project? And then after the class ended, I kept it going and I'm working on publishing it as a paper. But basically what I did is I analyzed 16 episodes of 2 popular industrial design podcasts, or at least they were popular among the people that I surveyed to ask them what's the most commonly known industrial design podcasts. And this was in like 2021. So I took 8 episodes from each podcast in which US-based industrial designers were interviewed by the hosts. And so 8 of the interviews were with female designers and 8 were with male designers. There was no non-binary people interviewed in the podcast. And one of the first things I had noticed is like, okay, a lot of times when they're talking, they're saying things like, basically they're using male language to describe designers in general. So they might say something like, oh yeah, I had to make sure the guys out there had enough money to feed their families. Something like that. Well, when talking about industrial designers, they're presuming that industrial designers are all men through their language. And I thought, like, is this a trend In the podcast, like the way that I can do that is I can get transcripts of the podcast and look through it and, highlight all the times that this happens, or highlight all the times that they talk about a female designer or a male designer and see what they're doing. So I did all that for these episodes. And then I came up with basically these findings that were really depressing. So they were constantly using this kind of male language to describe designers, as I mentioned, but they were also giving the female designers less speaking time. So not only did these podcasts invite female guests way less often, one of the podcasts, I think they used to be at 94% of the episodes were with male guests, and now they've added more episodes. So the percentage of female is like maybe now like 2%.
Jesus.
The other one was a little better. It was more like 60-40, but still not great. Like women were still represented less often. And then the episodes where they interviewed women were shorter. And within the episodes, like the hosts took up more of the talking space when the guest was a woman, if that makes sense.
Gosh, I want to know now if they like edited out more of what she said because they were like, this isn't important, or like, why were they less? Yeah, we don't know. We'll never know. But
I don't think that they really cut it down. Like, I know that you take a lot of care with your podcast. And so you cut out maybe the more boring parts, which I think is awesome. I don't know if they do that. So I'm not sure, but that's a good question. Also, when they were just talking about designers that they'd worked with, like colleagues, they mentioned overall, everybody mentioned female designers a lot less often than they mentioned men. And they said way nicer things about the men. So they would say things like, oh yeah, he was the smartest person I know. Like he's one of the most talented people I've ever met. But they weren't saying stuff like that about female designers. There was only 2 times out of all the episodes that they said anything positive like that about a woman. And it was in the same group with a man. So they would be like, oh yes, Laura and Jeff were 2 of the greatest design engineers. And then they would go on and be like, yeah, Jeff is awesome. Now he works at GE. Then they said something about Jeff and they didn't say anything else about Laura, except like a combined compliment with Jeff.
Where there is less women in the field. So
that's true. That's true. There are less women in the field.
Less to talk about. If someone doesn't have, if the mission isn't to try to diversify and maybe give more voice, then we just talk about what we know and our environment.
Yeah. I wasn't surprised that they mentioned women less often. That made sense. But I did notice that when it was a male speaker, they mentioned women less often relative to what the female speakers mentioned.
Oh.
So the female speakers, maybe like 40% of the people they mentioned were women, but for the male speakers, only 10% of the people they mentioned were women. And I don't think it's likely that the woman had worked with more other women colleagues necessarily than the man.
No,
had.
probably not. I mean, probably the opposite.
She's
the only person, in the environment.
I was really surprised how women weren't complimented.
Right. It's not hard to say the same thing about how
there.
great it is to work with people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Wow. I also have to say that, like, we thought it might be hard to find women to interview, and it hasn't been. We've always had somebody to interview. There's a lot of women doing design that are, like, definitely worth talking to.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess it does have to be a bit of an intention, like you're saying, Margaret, but it's not like it's not doable. It's pretty manageable to find people to talk to. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, that study, honestly, is one of the reasons why I think what you all are doing is so powerful, because not only are you providing a voice for women designers who aren't getting interviewed on other podcasts, but I think you're also in some ways like taking back the narrative, because these other podcasts are fairly popular. They have a high listenership. People are hearing this stuff. So they're hearing, no nice compliments about women designers and all these great compliments about male designers, or they're hearing male designers get invited back for 3 guest episodes, right? And like women being 2% of the episodes. They're hearing this message that's like women designers aren't very important in industrial design. That's not being stated explicitly, but it's implicit in all of that. And it's contributing to what we were talking about before, this kind of masculinization of the field. Like, yes, great designers are men, and we will have them as guests on our podcast.
Which is maybe a really good moment to segue into talking about the design work that you do, because the research is only one half of all of your qualifications and talent, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about the medical design work that you do? You gave us a little context at the beginning about your daughter, and if you want to expand on that, we'd love to hear about it. But then, how you transition from those products into working at this company that works on fall risk assessment, fall prevention. Was that also a personal life experience?
In some ways it was. Like, I do have multiple older relatives who have fallen and who that eventually was kind of what led up to their death. So falls are super serious for anyone who's had a grandparent fall. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. But really, I joined the company because, as I said before, I was looking for an internship opportunity in my city, and living in Houston isn't a big hub of design and manufacturing the way that maybe like the Midwest is. It's not a big tech hub. So med tech is really one of the main areas for design opportunity. So I started working there and I ended up really liking it. So I just stayed, basically. But what we do there, so the co-founders of the company, they were doing research at NASA when they designed the technology. And basically what they were supposed to do is find a way to measure balance in space. Because when people are in zero gravity, their balance really deteriorates because they're not really using their muscles the same way since they're floating around in space. Mm-hmm. So they needed to measure, like a lot of astronauts, when they come back from space, they'll have terrible balance and they can have falls because they haven't been using their muscles the same way.
Right.
So they realized that this technology wouldn't just be good for space, but it would also be good for older adults on Earth. Because right now, a lot of the balance screening tools that doctors use is like, how many times can you walk back and forth between these two chairs in 30 seconds or something like that? Like something that's not quite as precise and objective as maybe the way we measure blood pressure or heart rate or all these other things that will be measured in a doctor's office. So essentially, the product looks like a bathroom scale, and you stand on it, stand still for a minute. And during that minute, your body will make these like micro motions. And we have a machine learning algorithm that runs in the scale that will then give a balance score from 1 to 10. And the lower scores predict a higher risk of falling in the next 12 months. So my role in the company has been partly in the engineering and partly in the design, as I was telling you before. Since it's a medical device, like the process of getting it into production is quite slow. So that's why, as I mentioned before, I joined when we were still doing like our prototypes for our clinical tests, because we needed to kind of publish papers to show that this device works. And then as I went on and we started to talk to manufacturers, I was helping talk to the manufacturer and work on the engineering, like work with the engineers. Since I have a background in engineering, obviously I wasn't in manufacturing engineering, but I can still understand, what's going on in this MATLAB code that we need to do, or some common things that engineers will use. So part of my work related to the engineering, like validation testing that we needed to do for our device. And then part of it is on the more creative side. So working on the industrial design, working on the like UX and visual design of our app. I've done work on our website. I did work on our logo. Like anything that was designed for a while was just me. And then over time, we sometimes got to have design interns, and now we have another designer that works there as well. So that was also a good chance for me to start working on teaching and mentoring other people too along the way.
That's such a great confluence of skills, because like you have the engineering background and then you've put a lot of your time and energy into the like rigorous research. It seems like both are needed as well as design at this company. Do you think that's just typical of working in medtech? Do you think it's because it's more of a startup entrepreneurial environment, or both?
I can't speak to all of medtech since this is the only medical company that I've worked at, but there's definitely a very like pro-research culture, I guess, in the company, because the two co-founders, they hold PhDs, they're researchers. And then one of the other employees was also a PhD researcher. So I think there's just a high concentration of people who have really good research skills in the company. And I think that is probably also partly what encouraged me to get more into research and do my PhD, is enjoying working with these people. It's also been a chance for me to get involved in research, like doing publications and kind of building toward my PhD. This company and working in this job has been a good avenue for that for me.
It's refreshing to hear about a company that's really pro-research and staffed with people that are familiar with it and supportive. I feel like it's a common story to hear that at a company there's like a bare minimum of research, or like to not do too much because you could be spending the time in development and implementation and execution, that somehow it's like taking away. Do you think that there's something to that to the rest of the industry?
I had never thought about it that way, because the company that I work in, like the people who are doing research, they're not doing the same thing that like designers necessarily mean by research. Like we're not doing design research. A lot of the times we're doing more academic research. So it's not always about like how do our users use the product. Although me and the other designer do really try to push that kind of research. And the biggest barrier for that is just, oh, our customers aren't replying to our survey. They're not, we want to know and they're not answering us. But definitely the culture is super supportive. Like if we say, oh, we want to do this customer research survey study, like everyone's like, yeah, we do need to do that. So I agree. We really believe that the data can tell us, what we should do. And we're not just going to make something up or like assume we already know the answer.
Yeah, I think Ginger's on point with that. Making sense that in a medical context that gets prioritized more.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody already understands the value of it. Do you have to present it in a more academic way, though? Like, do you have to present even your design research findings in the similar way that you do your PhD research?
I haven't really done that, no. So some of the research projects that I've been involved in the company, we have published them, but that's more like a technical engineering sort of research, if that makes sense. But I think there's definitely room to do that. And that's something I would like to do, is kind of bring more, kind of like use more of my academic research skills in the design research area and like overlap the two areas more. I think that would be really exciting.
What does that look like and why is it good?
I think what it would mean to me is to really use some of the research tools that we use in academic research on the design research data that we get. So I'm pretty sure, I don't know anyone who's a UX researcher at Google or something, but I know that they're hiring people with a PhD to do their UX research, right? So they're going to get a bunch of data from how their users are using their products. And then they're going to do like statistical analysis on that data that maybe somebody who hasn't been trained in those statistical tools won't be able to do. But they'll be able to see like, hey, when we did this A/B test, B was definitely better because this statistical test and this statistical test showed us this and this. So I think that's kind of where the opportunity comes, is that you can use, especially like larger sets of quantitative data, and really make sense of it when you have this certain training in kind of the statistics-based research.
Where should designers go to get that training, or how should they develop these skills?
I am sure that there's some online courses that you could take. I'm not the best person to answer that, because obviously you can go enroll in a PhD program and learn it that way, which is what I did. But I think the difficult thing is for designers who want to get a PhD, like there aren't a lot of design PhDs that are funded. So there's not a lot of design PhDs that you're not going to have to pay your own money to get the degree, which you wouldn't want to do that. For a PhD, you would want one where they're going to pay you a low stipend, but at least you're not paying. So during my PhD, I got paid a stipend, every semester to be a research assistant, or you could be a teaching assistant, and that covers your tuition and also gives you a little bit of pay. So for designers who want to do that, I think it might be maybe there's more opportunities in like HCI, like human computer interaction. Industrial design, there aren't a lot of PhD programs at all. And the ones that I do know of do not give funding, at least not for all 4 years or however many years it takes. So that's part of the reason that my PhD is in technology. It's not in design. So I wasn't doing design during the PhD. I was just doing more typical academic research, essentially, and being trained in how to do that.
But you can apply it to what matters to you. And in this case,
Absolutely.
It was easy for you to apply it to design. So that's an interesting take, actually, that maybe if you're getting a PhD and you still want to be a design-focused person, it can be on an adjacent way of thinking.
Yeah.
I think as we start to wind down here, I would just really love for you to tell us about, a handful of things that you really hope you get to research in the next few years. Sort of what is standing out to you as, it really needs to get looked at.
This is just going to sound like a boring idea, but it's just that no one has bothered to do it, which is what I want to do is interview a bunch of female designers, especially some who are older and who have been in the field for a long time, and collect their experiences and analyze that and write about it and share it. Because even that is not happening, at least not for people who've worked in the US. Maybe there's a little bit, like there's a few papers from Ireland or Australia or something, but even that is not done. Like that sounds like such low-hanging fruit. And I think the same could be done and should be done for other marginalized identities in design. So whether that's other gender identities or people who are not heterosexual, people who are not white, like everything else is not being written about. It's not being studied. People are talking about it, and people are I don't want to say nobody's writing about it and nobody's studying it. So that's not the right way to say it. What I mean is, in an academic context and publishing in academic settings is not happening. It is happening in more casual settings, which is great. And I think is definitely a good starting point. But I wish that more researchers need to pay more attention to design. Even researchers could maybe not even be from design, but they could be from other fields, because I think design is really influential and important in society. And so we need to understand, like, why are only certain types of people being welcomed into the jobs that create things that are for all types of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a serious issue that I think researchers from many disciplines should look at.
Absolutely. Well, Margaret, do you want to hit us with your very important question?
Yes, this question is very significant because it tells you so much about the person. So could you tell us, please, what is your favorite color?
I knew you were going to ask that, so I tried to decide, but I couldn't. So it's like a tie between, one is Kelly green.
Ooh.
And the other one is like more like mint green, which is, so I guess green is the answer.
I need to Google Kelly green. Why is it called Kelly green? Oh, okay, I'm Googling it.
Okay.
After the common Irish family name, Kelly.
Oh, okay.
I feel like it's everywhere in Boston.
I would say it's like a shamrock Boston green.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. I don't associate it with that, but that's because I'm not from the East Coast, so I don't think about Boston.
Mint green.
Mint green, yeah.
Mint
That's
green.
like, I feel like the mint green one is like the millennial, lame millennial mint green.
You can maybe go with shamrock then.
You're going to strip her out of mint green? I think you're only struggling with the fact that you have two because of like getting so detail oriented on the shade of green, which I really respect. I think we can allow you to have both.
All right, thanks.
For sure. For sure. And then a question that we always like to ask our guest, as you know, because you're awesome and you listen to this show. Can you tell us what you're bringing to the table that's really specific to you and why it's really important for you to be in this field right now?
Well, I think this isn't going to deviate too much from what we've just been talking about, but I hope that what I'm bringing to the table is kind of the ability to meld multiple worlds. So whether that's the more academic, engineering, research side, but also the design and creative side, and try to see, like, what can I find out by bringing those two ways of thinking together? I mean, I think that I like to believe that part of the reason I was able to kind of push this thing forward with the incorrect information about spatial skills was because I could be creative in my research and like do something different. Don't just do the same experiments that everybody's been doing, but look at it in a new way. I like to think that my like design creative part of me is what helped me be creative in the research. And then I hope that my more kind of rigorous academic research training can help me do good research in the field of design also.
Yeah, I think it's really lucky that you're doing this research. I mean, we found out even today that you've uncovered things that are being overlooked. And it's really encouraging, I think, for more people in our field to get PhDs, even if just so that they can really participate in talking about our field in the rigorous way that so many other disciplines talk about the work that they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, your students are very lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm excited to see, I feel like a lot of them are going to get motivated to think about design in a more academic way too, which is cool to think of new people approaching the field like that.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Kristi, could you tell our listeners where they can follow along with the research that you're doing or reach out to you if you're comfortable with that?
Sure. I am trying to keep my website updated with my research. So the website is kristibartlett.me. And there's a contact me button on the website, which you're welcome to use, which will send me an email. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on Instagram. My Instagram is Kristi Bartlett Design, or you can find me on Threads. That's a half joke because I don't know what anyone's going to be writing about on there. But
oh my God, she's cooler than us, guys. It's official.
You guys need to make a thread.
Researcher.
Make one for Women in Design Seattle.
Oh God. Sure. Why don't you come be our thread manager, Kristi?
We need an intern ourselves.
That's so funny. And yeah, everybody, you can find us at WID_Seattle on Instagram. I would really love it, actually, if you come find us on there, because we are about to celebrate our anniversary as a podcast.
Oh,
and
awesome.
so we're going to be posting some prompts and questions that we want to hear from the audience about. We also are on beyondraypodcast.com, our beautiful website that Margaret designed for us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah. Kristi, it was so fun. I feel like we even barely scraped the surface with the actual research that you've done. I just want to talk to you about it more.